In a previous episode, I covered one of the lost cities on Galveston Island, South Galveston, a city development in Galveston in the 1890s that never quite took off. And there are more than a couple developments on Galveston Island that were either competing with the city of Galveston or piggybacking off of its success. While doing research into early Galveston history, mainly between when Jean Lafitte left in 1820 to the beginning of the Texas Revolution, initially I couldn't find much beyond Mexico establishing a customs house here on Galveston Island. But I was interested in the people who lived on the island. Were they some of Jean Lafitte's pirates left behind? Were they immigrants or outlaws from the United States? Who was here before the city of Galveston was founded? And what the heck is Saccarap? Let's get into it. Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Thank you to our video sponsor, The Daily News, bringing you the news since 1842. Texas' oldest newspaper. Support your local newspaper, The Daily News. Many of you may already know about Jean Lafitte, a pirate and privateer who was here on Galveston Island between 1816 and 1820. Jean Lafitte was kicked off Galveston Island by the United States Navy, where it's reported he burned his settlement to the ground. Some of Lafitte's men actually stayed behind on Galveston Island. In 1821, Texas becomes a part of Mexico, and by 1825, a Mexican customs house is built here on the island, somewhere along Harborside between 12th and 14th Street. And over the next decade, between the quarrels and skirmishes between the people of Texas and the government of Mexico, Galveston Island was plagued with snakes, hurricanes, and disease, and it wasn't a very welcome environment to settlers. Although by 1825, Galveston was officially a port of Mexico, the channel at the port was extremely shallow, and sourcing water and supplies here on the island was extremely difficult. But there were still settlers on Galveston Island before the city of Galveston had even been formed. Well, according to the historical documentation I poured over the past few weeks, they were right here. Let's go take a look. The village of Saccarap was somewhere between modern-day 11th Street and 14th Street along Harborside Drive, which mostly lied where UTMB sits today. Saccarap was originally formed by immigrants from Maine. The name Saccarap comes from those immigrants who came to Galveston, naming their settlement Saccarap after Saccarappa, Maine, or the Saccarappa River. Saccarap is a very common shortening of the word Saccarappa, found in many Maine sailors' sea shanties. Saccarap on Galveston Island started sometime around 1835. No one knows exactly what date. From 1821 to 1836, Galveston was technically part of Mexico. The Mexican government designated Galveston as a port back in 1825 and built a customs house here. But during the Texas Revolution, Galveston became Texas' last point of defense. Many families fleeing Santa Anna's army took shelter on the island, where the Texas Navy was stationed. And once the Battle of San Jacinto was won, those people who'd moved to Galveston were eager to make it back to mainland Texas. After the Texas Revolution, new settlers flooded into Texas, seizing the chance to buy cheap land. Among them was a Canadian named Michelle Menard, who secured title for the eastern portion of Galveston Island. In 1836. He, along with several associates, organized the Galveston City Company. They laid out the town in a grid and started selling lots. By the end of 1836, Galveston had grown to a town of about 60 families and 100 buildings, and the city of Galveston was finally incorporated in 1839. But on the extreme eastern portion of Galveston Island, right along Harborside, there was another town called Saccarap. And this early town of Saccarap was kind of a competitor to Galveston. And the town even had major investors. One of them named Amasa Taylor. Colonel Amasa Taylor of Massachusetts moved to Texas in 1835 to recover from a bout with yellow fever. After hostilities between Mexico and Texas broke out, he joined the Texas Army in late 1835 and helped drum up volunteers to fight in Texas. Turner fought at the Battle of San Jacinto, and after the Revolution in the Republic of Texas, he was stationed in Galveston, where he began to understand the prospects of what Galveston Island could be if there was only a little investment. It could be a major port on the Gulf Coast. I've read a few different conflicting accounts about the relationship between Saccarap and Galveston. Some historians say it was more of a symbiotic relationship, with a little bit of competition. But I've also read that the competition was extremely fierce. But if you think about it, in the 1830s, building an economy was a fight for survival. And if your wharf would succeed over the other man's wharf, you would succeed in a winner-takes-all battle. So in the late 1830s, why would immigrants from Maine move to Galveston Island? Pretty much a barren sandbar. There were two main factors going on in the northeastern United States at that time that might make people want to leave: the Panic of 1837 and the Aroostook Wars. The Panic of 1837. Cities like New York and Boston were major financial banking hubs, and states like Maine had a robust timber and shipbuilding industry. But in 1837, a financial crisis struck the United States. Originating from speculative lending and the collapse of land speculation caused widespread economic turmoil across the United States, particularly impacting the Northeast. Banks in the region collapsed. Real estate values plummeted, exacerbating financial losses for land speculators, sparking debates over economic policy and banking regulation. Land prices in the Maine timberlands was the first to crumble, essentially bringing the economy in the northeastern United States to a halt. Many debtors or people who lost everything ended up coming to Texas to either flee their debtors or start a new life on new land. And in the 1830s and 40s, the Republic of Texas was very welcoming to American immigrants. And in 1837, the Republic of Texas was only about a year old. This financial crisis in the Northeast lasted until 1845, which was also the final year of the Republic of Texas before joining the United States. It's more than likely that not every person who left Maine to come to Galveston Island to settle was fleeing the financial crisis. But in the 1830s to 1840s timeframe, there were economic motives. Aroostook Wars. Between 1838 and 1839, a confrontation between the United States and the UK over a boundary between New Brunswick and the state of Maine. Although there was no all-out battle during the Aroostook Wars in Maine, there was talk of war for years, until it was quelled around 1840. After the Texas Revolution and the Republic of Texas was established, Texas was pretty much desperate to build their economy and population. And for what Texas lacked in cash, they made up in land, offering 320 acres to single men or 640 acres to families if they came to Texas and stayed for 3 years. This type of land ownership was extremely enticing to those who may never be able to afford that kind of land in their home country. Why didn't Saccarap build up to be just like modern-day Strand? And why was it eventually forgotten? Colonel Amasa Turner had extremely high hopes for Saccarap, envisioning it becoming the town center of Galveston Island. He personally invested in constructing a wharf, hotel, and ice house. And the hotel he built was the first hotel built on Galveston Island, aptly named the Galveston Hotel. When Saccarap's Galveston Hotel was built, it had 20 rooms. And it even hosted performances by major stars of the 1830s, one of which was Mr. Ben DeBar, an extremely popular entertainer in the 1830s and 40s. Now, when it comes to building a wharf or a dock, Saccarap was not in the right spot. It did not have prime harbor real estate, which is around modern-day 20th and 21st Street. Saccarap was located further east, closer to UTMB. And back then, before dredging projects, that water was extremely shallow, making the wharf that they constructed only reachable by small boat during high tide. And unfortunately, the first wharf they built was infested with woodworms and began to fall apart. To me, it is absolutely crazy that Saccarap isn't talked about more often. One of the reasons is Galveston County's first courthouse was built in Saccarap. And one of the more obscure things I found in my research into Saccarap is that nobody really knew how to spell it. Kind of like Mississippi, you have to sound it out in your head. So when I switched up the spelling of Saccarap, I was able to find some documents from the Republic of Texas Army, where they had an encampment at Camp Saccarap, adding to the lore and history of this village named Saccarap. By 1838, there were around 300 people living in Saccarap, many of which had immigrated to the Republic of Texas from Maine. Now, not everyone who lived in Saccarap was from Maine. You had people from all over, New Orleans, New York, Europe, you name it. But some of the most famous residents were veterans from the Battle of San Jacinto.
There were a lot of veterans of the Battle of San Jacinto living there. So they decided they would have a reenactment. So they had the two sides, the cavalry and the soldiers. And in all this excitement, somebody's sword punctured one of the horses around his hip. And it was bleeding profusely. And the guy who was riding the horse rode around and around trying to get it to stop, and he ended up coming to his own house, and all this blood was spurting out, and his poor wife comes out, and she starts wailing and carrying on that he's been injured. And the quote in the article said, "And so he said, 'Stop your lamentations, woman. You don't know the bit about war.' And with that, he took off and rode up and down the streets until the poor horse almost fell over."
Now, it's hard to imagine Galveston today without its oak trees, but in the mid-1800s, there were very few trees to speak of besides the ones you planted on your own. Now, that becomes a problem when you try to build a city. Sourcing lumber on Galveston Island was extremely difficult, unless you had a lumber connection in Maine. One of Galveston's most notable businessmen in the mid to late 1800s was Charles W. Adams, who came to Galveston Island on a lumber ship from Maine. Michelle B. Menard, a Canadian who is really responsible for founding the Galveston City Company. Now, exploring the relationship between Galveston and Saccarap, let's look to Maine, where Galveston was getting much of its lumber to build big, extravagant homes here on the island. The 1838 Michelle B. Menard home, one of the oldest homes on Galveston Island, was prefabricated in Saccarap, Maine, and shipped down to Galveston Island to be built on this lot. And this isn't the only one. The Samuel May Williams home, just a couple blocks away, was another one with a very similar story. Where the lumber was cut, the home was prefabbed and shipped down to Galveston. And the settlement stuck around until about 1839, or the official formation of the city of Galveston, where the settlers in Saccarap essentially just joined in on Galveston Island. However, that area continued to be called Saccarap for many decades after. And as the city of Galveston grew through the mid and late 1800s, the settlement of Saccarap was essentially forgotten, with a few brief references here and there in books and historical documents.
There are a series of letters at the Rosenberg Library that this gentleman found and published a book, and they are letters from a woman from Maine who came to Galveston in 1838.
Now, if you are interested in early Galveston history, mainly between 1838 and 1850, I highly recommend buying this book, From Maine to Galveston, Republic of Texas, The Life and Letters of Lucy Parker Shaw, and no relation to me that I can find. This book is a series of letters that Lucy wrote to her mother back in Maine after Lucy immigrated to Galveston in 1838. Mr. James Valentino did an amazing job adding historical context in between each letter. And to read the descriptions of the gardens, the people, the port, the ships that were entering the port is unbelievable. So go and get this book if you have a chance. Although in these letters, Lucy never mentions the word Saccarap. Not necessarily discounting that Saccarap existed in 1838, but she does mention all the people moving from Maine to Galveston and living close to one another, along with some other grimy details of early Galveston history. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and follow us on social media. We are everywhere. And if you haven't yet, go check out the podcast. We've got hours and hours of historical content on that podcast feed. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Galveston Unscripted.